Good morning, one and all. On behalf of the School of Social Sciences, I welcome you all to the third and final day of the Golden Always. We will begin our day today with a very special lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Ajay Skaria. I invite the speaker and the chair, Professor Bhukya, to please be on stage. Professor Bhukya teaches at the University of Hyderabad. He earned his PhD from the University of Warwick in UK. Specializing in modern Indian history, he focuses on histories of subaltern and marginalized groups. Among many of his notable works are Colonialism and the Nomads in South India, 2012, History of Modern Telangana, 2017, and The Roots of the Periphery, also 2017. I request the chair, Professor Bhukya and Professor Skaria, to please be on stage, and Professor Bhukya to take the session forward. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I really never realized that I would have a day where I'll be chairing Professor Ajay Skaria's lecture. I mean, Ajay actually started impacting our academics when I was just entering into academics. I saw his book, Hybrid Histories, first time on Atlur Murli's table. I mean, the history we heard about political history, cultural history, social history, and all that. But what is this hybrid history? And then I just flipped through the content and all, and immediately I went to Book Point, Himayat Nagar, and bought the book. Started reading it. Couldn't understand anything. Because Foucault Dada, Derrida Dada very much exist in the book. But in the second reading, I could make sense of the book. So it's completely a different venture and different history, which I actually spiritually took it as a kind of Bible. I think a book came in 1999. By then, I already read David Hardiman's Coming of the Devi. I took both the books, Hybrid History and Coming of the Devi, and traveled to UK. So that's how, I mean, still Ajay, David Hardiman remain or exist in all my thought processes. Thank you so much, Ajay, for being here, and I thank our Dean for giving me this opportunity. I feel it's privileged, honored. So, without much discussion, I'll just invite Dr. Ajay to speak to us in this morning. Ajay is speaking on the part of the Indigenous, Adivasis, and the Subaltern intimation of freedom. I think we better listen to him. I think do I need to introduce him formally or no need? No? Yeah, everybody knows Ajay Skaria. Okay, so thank you so much. Over to you, Ajay. Yeah.
Thank you for this really very generous introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And as I was saying yesterday, I'm meeting so many people that I've only read till now, and that's fantastic. And as I was also telling people, I'm just amazed by the intensity and the existential urgency that you as students are bringing to the questions you ask here, and that has been very powerful to see, right? Anyway, today this talk that I'm giving emerges out of an assignment I was given around this time last year, that of reflecting on the personal and intellectual context of the book that Bhangya just mentioned, Hybrid Histories, and that of exploring in the process the stakes of subaltern studies today, project then and now, right? What it might involve today. And I will say I approached the project with some trepidation because while Bhangya said very nice things about the book, it's never nice. It's normally not a nice experience reading your own stuff after very long. So, and I thought I would find it dissatisfying. I have. Still, reading it again has also been to encounter more forcefully the stakes that I could only dimly see then, right? And I can see more clearly now. And what follows is in the spirit of encountering hybrid histories again today, when a powerful new field of Adivasi studies is emerging, of which Bhangya is such a prominent part, and making me reformulate and rethink much of what I said then, right? So that's the spirit in which I'll be speaking. Now, writing in 2012, Partha Chatterjee notes that those who first came together to launch Subaltern Studies group were all young in the 1970s, and this had both subjective and objective implications. Objectively, he notes that the conditions of the time, including the emergency, made them believe that the political order of India lacked foundation in popular consent, and the facade of electoral democracy would be thrown aside once more should it become inconvenient to the rulers. And he went on to argue that a crucial element in the structure of rebel consciousness in colonial India was the location of the state and ruling authorities outside the bounds of the peasant community. And this, structural element of externality, and negativity for him explained the nature of peasant consciousness. And he was therefore saying that, the subaltern rebel of the Subaltern Studies group now seemed like a throwback to the early days of the British Raj. Right? Now, Partha's talking of the original Subaltern Studies group. I was invited to join the group much later, around 1995 or so. I was a graduate. I was an undergrad when the first volumes of Subaltern Studies came out, and along with M.S.S. Pandian and Shail Mayaram, and the three of us could be counted as the second generation of the collective. And like many of the others who were young in the early 80s and in the 80s and early 90s and cut their intellectual teeth on subaltern studies, we experienced quite a different political and intellectual world from the one that Partha mentions. Perhaps the key difference in the culture of progressive politics was this. We came of age at a time when what retrospectively came to be called the new social movements, the NSMs, right, had reached full form. Right? And so we should ask, let's begin therefore by asking, what was conceptually distinctive about the new social movements? If I'm to put it briefly, I would say that they were focused more on oppression than on exploitation. Yeah? Very schematically put, and drawing here also on Gopal Guru's formulations, exploitation involves making the exploited into a what? Right? That is to say, it involves instituting extractive relationships with individuals and groups by making them into entities capable of producing measurable value. By its very nature, of course, exploitation is never only, measurable or objective, right? While it is an objectification, it is also, after all, making a who into a what, right? And in that sense, this objectification itself unleashes what Gopal Guru calls the subjective process of alienation. Exploitation is most evidently at work, one might say, in relations where labor is involved. Not only in industry and agriculture, but also in caste and gender relations, to the extent that these involve making the dominated into a what. Right? What I'd like to stress, and this is in contrast to exploitation, is oppression, right? It is what might be called, if you call exploitation the violence of what, you could call oppression the violence of who, right? What I mean is that oppression involves extractive or non-extractive relations where the dominated set themselves apart, where the dominated find themselves set apart, cut off from the lines of mobility that might allow them a dignified relationship with themselves and the world, right? So that dignity becomes in some senses crucial here, right? In other words, oppression is inseparable from a setting apart of the oppressed on the basis of existential identities. Yeah? What is an existential identity, you might ask? I just mean by that an identity that one cannot abandon even if one wanted to. Yeah? That is to say, identities like those of gender, of race, or caste. In many cases, nation, religion, there's nothing necessarily left or right about an existential identity. It's just an identity that one cannot abandon even if one wanted to. Right? So, where exploitation extracts things and goods, oppression works by constricting the possibilities for the dignity that is an existential requirement. Right? Where in exploitation, what the dominated lose is what the same as what the dominant receive. For example, labor power. Right? In oppression, the dominated lose one thing and the dominant receive another thing. Right? The dominated lose their dignity, the dominant receive honor. Right? So, it's something so different things are happening. You're losing one thing and the dominant are receiving another thing. And though oppression is most evidently at work in relations of gender, caste or race, it is surely at work also in the violence of making a who into a what. Right? This is why Derrida remarks on the terrible reversibility of the who and the what. Yeah. The reason I venture this thumbnail sketch of the difference and relation between exploitation and oppression is twofold. First, it allows us to reframe the subaltern studies project. Right? The emergence of subaltern studies itself is, of course, shaped by the beginnings of the increasing prominence of the new social movements. Right? Social movements against oppression are, of course, not entirely new, as many scholars have shown. What is new, however, is that from around the mid-20th century, movements against oppression more explicitly claim a public space, right? More explicitly displace and challenge the older labor and peasant mobilizations, which centered more on the violence of what? Yeah? And already in the early volumes of subaltern studies, we see the argument that exploitation relations of production are not by themselves enough to understand domination, that oppression is central too. Right? Thus, Dipesh Chakrabarty's scholarship on the working classes in the Bengal jute mills, or in a very different way, Shahid Amin and David Hardiman and Gyan Pandey approached the peasant. Right? And even more fundamental sense, right, in which the emphasis on the figure on oppression constitutes the figure of the subaltern is evident in Gayatri Spivak's well-known question, can the subaltern speak? And the answer she performs, no, the subaltern cannot speak. I mean, now, sometimes people too glibly say, what is this? I mean, the subaltern can speak. The question is, can the historian hear? Right? But that is to misunderstand the question she's asking. Right? When she asks this question, what she's speaking in a very delimited sense of talking. It is that form of talking that claims agency and autonomy, that claims intelligibility itself. Right? This is why speech places itself above all other forms of writing, and this is what Derrida, for example, criticizes speech for. Right? It devalues all other forms of presentation of self to sensibility rather than intelligibility. Right? For elites, the subaltern cannot speak; they only babble, or in elite romanticism, burble. Right? So Spivak, and I'm not defending many of Spivak's other remarks, including some recent remarks, but Spivak, stands this elitism upside down to implicitly offer a criterion of the subaltern, and that criterion is what I want to tease out. Right? And I'll put it this way, to put it in a formulaic way. The subaltern is the one who has suffered not just a social, economic, and political violence, right, but a psychic and epistemic violence, right? This epistemic psychic violence bars the subaltern from agency and autonomy, or more broadly, from the dominant ways of being free in modern societies. Yeah? Being apart, to draw on Jacques Rancier's famous phrase, though not much else from him, being apart is a constitutive of the figure of the subaltern. And it is fidelity to this apartness, right, that distinguishes the subaltern studies tradition at its finest, because every tradition is always complicated, right? At its finest, it is fidelity to this apartness that distinguishes the subaltern studies tradition from the tradition of history from below. Yeah. So that's the first reason why I'm paying attention to the distinction between oppression and exploitation. The second reason is actually more relevant, right, to the concerns of this essay, is that being attentive to this distinction allows us to encounter the distinctiveness of what I call the subaltern intimation of freedom. Yeah. The new social movements, Gail Umwet notes, are new in that they themselves, through the ideologies they generate, define their exploitation and oppression. Right? The system that generates this and the way to end this exploitation and oppression in new terms, related to traditional Marxism, but having clear differences from it. In other words, the experience of subalternity is also the intimation of a freedom incompatible not only with liberal, but also with mainstream Marxist understandings of freedom. Right? A liberal freedom is inadequate because even if specific subalterns overcome enormous violence, a violence that is not just socioeconomic but psychic and psychic and epistemic, even if they overcome enormous violence to gain access to liberal freedom, right, they will continue to reproduce the world that has subalternity as its underside, right? So subalternity will remain. Maybe some specific subalterns will no longer be subaltern, right? Mainstream Marxists of freedom similarly fail to recognize the epistemic psychic violence, which is a distinctive mark of the subaltern. So, a freedom that seeks to abolish and annihilate subalternity itself must proceed differently. Yeah? It is this difference that I've sometimes described in some of my other writings that I've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years as an equality of the minor. Yeah? And that I'm here describing as a subaltern intimation of freedom. A freedom that, even as it exits from the condition of subalternity, seeks not to make a new group subaltern instead. Right? Now, of course, you might ask, is it not odd to talk of a subaltern intimation of freedom when the very figure of the subaltern is constituted by subordination? Right? And I will just say that, in the intimation, between the intimation of freedom and the experience of subordination and domination, it is the intimation of freedom which comes first, right? Because it is only the intimation of freedom, right, which makes the latter capable of being experienced. Yeah. To give an example, in our common sense, I'm not defending this common sense, I'm just giving you our common sense, right? In our common sense, if I were to say that this podium is not free, you'd say I'm making a category mistake, right? And why am I making a category mistake? Because we cannot think of this podium having free. If I had to say that the podium is oppressed, right, it would make no sense to you, right? Because I cannot think of the freedom of we cannot think of the freedom of the podium. Unless we can think the freedom of the podium, we cannot think the oppression of the podium, right? That's all I'm trying to say when I say that freedom comes before subordination. Yeah. In the work of the first generation of subaltern studies scholars, the concern with the subaltern intimation of freedom implicitly manifested itself in the emphasis on an autonomous domain of subalternity, relatively uninfluenced by elite culture, right? And I'll pass over this because I think all of you in this group there's a long discussion I have of this, because in a paper you have to explain what you say. Right? But I think in this room, all of you know that subaltern studies tradition well enough that I'll skip over that. And what I want to stress is that, look, later subaltern studies groups, scholars, de-emphasize that. But as they de-emphasize it, what is also lost often is the subaltern intimation of freedom. Right? For example, if you think of Partha's later work, the distinction between civil society and political society does not allow in any significant way for a subaltern intimation of freedom. Right? My point is basically that the subaltern intimation of freedom has been both a constitutive and an obscured aspect of the subaltern studies tradition. Obscured not least from the practitioners of the tradition themselves. Right? This is not really a criticism, because it is often the way that new thought comes into the world. That those who think new things often find it difficult to articulate entirely the newness of what they say. Right? It is only now that this aspect, the subaltern intimation of freedom, can be sensed more forcefully. Not, I should add, because the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, but because new futurities produce new paths. Right? Here I shall revisit hybrid histories in this spirit, asking about the subaltern intimation of freedom in that text, in its times, when that text is viewed from our times. Yeah? So, by the 80s and 90s, when I came of intellectual and political age, the new social movements were even more prominent by that time than they had been for the first generation of subaltern studies scholars. This gave the language of subalternity a new force in leftist political and social life. Symptomatically, the organization of which I was a fellow traveler during my BA and MA in the mid to late 60s, the Trotskyist organization, the Inqilabi Communist Sangatna, which was different from other parties of the traditional left, precisely because of its openness to and enthusiasm about new social movements. Amongst contemporaries in the ICS from my generation was the late Trupti Shah, who founded the feminist group Sahir. Another, a very dear friend, the late Beena Srinivasan, was a fierce feminist who founded the Rag Pickers Association, Swashray. So the questions, the feminist movement had made the gender question visible to us in a way much more visceral, than it arguably was to the first generation of subaltern studies scholars. Right? In my own case, the newly visible figure who pulled me in was the Adivasi. Yesterday when I was talking, I mentioned that I joined the Indian Express as a journalist from the time I was 18 till the time I was 23 when I started my PhD. Both through the ICS and through my work of the journalist, I learned of the movement against the Narmada Dam. Right? And the day I turned 19, for example, is especially memorable to me, because that day I received the preprint of a cover feature I had done for Express magazine on the Narmada movement. Right? My coverage of the movement led me to report extensively over the next few years from the Adivasi areas of Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh. And of course, I was inspired like Bhukya, but like Bhangya, and by the mentorship of David Hardiman at Surat, right? Because David Hardiman was at Surat in those days, right? Who also had a very quietly fierce commitment. He's an incredible person, really one of the most amazing persons I know. But he had a quietly fierce commitment to exploring the worlds of the Adivasi, All the same, our generation could not but be acutely aware that there were other more troubling ways of claiming identity. Right? In the mid to late 80s, Hindu-Muslim tensions and riots were a constant feature in Gujarat, as Jyotirmay knows only too well. Right? And yet, I at least was so optimistic about the NSMs that in retrospect, I feel I was not attentive enough to the mobilizations around the Hindu identity, even though I knew it was happening. Of course, to use the phrase in retrospect is also to succumb to a certain historicism, which I should also back away from that remark, right? Because there was nothing already given in the 80s and the early 90s about what can now appear as the inevitable rise of Hindutva, in the 21st century. For example, from what I've learned since. During the years that I was an undergrad and master's student in Vadodara, the city, a key figure in the city unit of the RSS was a man who was leading it in a new direction, which would lead a decade and a half later to the Gujarat pogrom of 2002, and later still to the making of Gujarat into the bastion of Hindu nationalism. Neither I, nor as far as I know, my fellow journalists at the time, were in any significant sense aware of the presence of that man. Today, all of us know his name, Narendra Modi, right? And I think I often think of this, right, that I did not know this, right, as a symptom of my blindness, right? So the question I'm getting to is this, right? What is the difference between the collective identity cathected by phenomena like Hindutva, which too talks of oppression, right? Oppression by Muslims, and what's the difference between that kind of identity and the identity involved in the subaltern apprehension of freedom, right? Suffice for now to note only one of the many differences, and this is something I'd like to think a bit more about. I would say that Hindutva talks primarily of an identity based on oppression, but not its connection with exploitation. Right? This is what allows it to portray Hindus as an oppressed community. And because it separates oppression and exploitation, Hindutva can give the oppressors a face, right? Make the oppressor a who, right? The Muslim, as we know very well. This is very different from the new social movements, which precisely because they are aware also of exploitation, treat the oppressor as both a who and a what. Yeah? And you can see this already in Ambedkar, right, who prefigures the sensibility of the NSMs and whose influence parallels and is in many ways enabled by the rise of the NSMs, right? Ambedkar, for example, is quite clear on many occasions that he's opposed to Brahmanism and not to Brahmins. And indeed, one of the distinctive features of the neoliberal age that we need to tackle with and think about much more is that we increasingly have an oppression without an oppressor. Yeah? And this existence of an oppression without an oppressor, right, is something that we really need to, in other words, oppression that is more purely structural than ever before. This is something that I really would again like to think a bit more about. Yeah? Okay. Now, because of the greater prominence of NSMs by the 80s and 90s, the claim about autonomy was not as easily available to our organization. We are acutely aware that it was inadequate to locate the state and ruling authorities outside the bounds of subaltern studies. We could not but also be aware of the fact that the state had been so governmentalized that into everyday life that even an oppositional relationship with the state could not be purely external. Right. And this I could see, for example, if you look at even in my PhD work, it's there, in my dissertation is there, and in the book is there, that there's a governmentalized nature of the colonial state. The colonial state is involved in the everyday life of Dangis. That has only become more acute than now. Now than then, right? So that's one, starting point. But that starting point leads to a new question, right? And the new question is this: how to conceptualize the subaltern relation with domination, if not in terms of externality? My response wasn't shaped in part by the particular place from which I came to it. Once I reached Cambridge in 1988, I was advised by Chris Bailey, and Bailey's work insisted, on the one hand, that there was too much local participation in colonial rule for it to be thought of as external, right? And on the other hand, that pre-colonial and local traditions remained so vibrant, that colonialism, even in its localized forms, was only one especially powerful force in the social relations of the subcontinent. Bailey thought that this was especially true in places like Dangs, where a certain form of indirect rule prevailed, much occurred outside the knowledge and influence of colonial rule. To describe this positioning of colonialism, there was an adjective that he toyed with at the time that I was his advisee, and that he recommended also to me. The adjective was paracolonial, right? It occurs only once in hybrid histories, and then only in an empirical manner. That I did not use it more is perhaps symptomatic of the fact that having cut my intellectual and political teeth on subaltern studies, right, I experienced a then inchoate dissatisfaction with Bailey's understanding of colonialism. That is to say, I was unhappy both with subaltern studies criticism of Chris, and at the same time, I didn't agree with Chris, right? A para-colonial approach, it is true, may be helpful in situations where governmental or state power is not particularly marked, and there are surely such spaces, right? But what it seemed to attenuate, at least in Chris's rendering, were not only relations of domination and subordination, and hence subalternity and the figure of the subaltern, but also the critical engagement with the coloniality of these relations that was necessary in order to be faithful to the subaltern apprehension of freedom, right? And I should add that it's part of Chris's extraordinary generosity that though I constantly shared my disagreements with him, right, this did not bother him in the slightest. In fact, he would constantly help me sharpen my arguments better, so that I could argue better against what he had argued, which is, I think, really his exemplary liberalism, I would say. I was drawn instead to the very specific subaltern apprehension of freedom that I encountered in Dungs. Towards the end of Hybrid Histories, I write of how Rising Gundusa, one of my closest interlocutors during my period in Dungs, quote, pointed at the shoes I was wearing and told me with much glee that his vadils would shoot at shoe prints if they saw them in Dungs. As I moved across more villages, the story was to be repeated over and again. In those days, they said only the sahibs and people from outside Dungs wore shoes. And so the bheels shot at shoe prints. The vadils did not want Sikhel Bane Lok, educated people in Dungs. As I write in the book, it is by no means clear that something like this really happened. But that was not the point. The time when his elders would shoot at the shoes, whom I talked to, at the shoes, was referred to as Mughlai, a time whose literal referent was likely Mughal rule, but which stood symbolically for a time of chut, right? A word whose translation would have to slide between liberty and freedom. The point of contrast to Mughlai was Mandani, a word whose literal referent was a demarcation of forests into reserved and protected forests, right? But which also referred symbolically to a modernity from a very distinctive perspective, as I put it then, that of groups such as Adivasis, whose identities have been created by modernity, but who have been made marginal by that very modernity, unquote. Likely since independence, Mandani was also the time of the Sikhel Bane Lok, the phrase that I translated as educated persons, but should have translated perhaps as literate persons, right? And not just literate. Here, literacy implied a domination over the Dangis, who portrayed themselves as illiterate in the broader sense of illiterate in the ways of the non-Dangis who dominated the region. Yeah? Though one can only speculate about this, the Mughlai-Mandani contrast was likely preceded by one between the Dang and the hilly regions or Desh, the plains. Right? In the 90s, when I was doing my field work, that contrast was still very much drawn and overlapped with that between Mughlai and Mandani, right? And a young scholar, Asta Prasad, who's finishing her PhD right now from Oxford, says that by now that contrast has more or less disappeared, right? But still there is very much of a sense of being Dangi, yeah, and it's contrasted in many ways to the plains, yeah. So, and there has emerged all the more strongly in the decades since I was there, another overlapping contrast, that between Adivasi and non-Adivasi. Yeah? The term Adivasi was likely coined, as I'm sure all of you know here, by the Gandhian Amritlal Thakrar as a translation of such terms as tribes and aborigines, right? And was increasingly used by the middle classes as a synonym for the post-independence legal category, scheduled tribes. In keeping with what was beginning to the practice amongst leftists then, Hybrid Histories avoided this equation of scheduled tribes with Adivasis. As we have come to recognize, legal terms such as scheduled tribes or scheduled castes are part of the cunning of recognition, what has sometimes been called the cunning of recognition. When the community so named embrace these governmental terms, they must in order to gain access to institutional resources, they also recognize themselves in the governmentalized terms that the state sees them in. Right? This governmentalized recognition, Adivasis cannot not want, to use another lovely phrase that Spivak introduces, right? It gives them, through it, they gain access to the freedoms that are institutionalized as rights. And yet, the subaltern intimation of freedom has nothing in common with these freedoms. So it is that this this governmentalized sense of Adivasi is only part of the sense that the word carries. In Dangi usage, the term also folds into it the senses carried earlier by Mughlai, and today by proper names such as Dangi and Asti and Adivasi. So Dangi, Mughlai, Adivasi. What matters most about these three terms, and not only them, the term Bhilraj worked analogously at the time I was doing my fieldwork, is that by the late 20th century, they detected an intimation of freedom specific to the Adivasi or Dangi experience. Now I think giving a distinctive twist to a recent raft of scholarship, beginning at least with Virginia Khacha's intervention in 1999, Bhangya crisply describes what is distinctive to this intimation when he says of the term Adivasi that it is a politico-epistemological claim to modernity. Yeah, I'd like to stay with this phrase, political epistemological claim to modernity. I think it deserves close attention. One might ask, does not every claim have political and epistemological stakes? And in a sense, yes, of course. I mean, one cannot speak without putting forth some political or epistemological claim, right? But to explicitly foreground a politico-epistemological claim is very different from foregrounding an empiricist or culturalist claim, right? An empiricist claim, for example, the claim that Adivasis are the original inhabitants of the subcontinent. Yeah? An empiricist claim conceals its politico-epistemological stakes from itself above all, right? And from others by implication, by asserting that it speaks not in the name of these stakes, but in the names of these facts themselves. That is making, to go back to yesterday's panel discussion, or was it day before, that is making a verifiable claim, right? That it is empirico-epistemological, so to speak, rather than politico-epistemological, right? A claim to indigeneity on these grounds will find itself constantly answering the question, are Adivasis in a historically verifiable sense the original inhabitants of the subcontinent, right? Which is, a pointless question to spend your life answering, honestly, right? By contrast, what is distinctive about the subaltern intimation of freedom is that it is first and foremost a politico-epistemological claim. Whether the claim is to being Dalit, Adivasi, black, woman, trans, or more, right? That is to say, it's a claim that where, in some senses, politicalness emerges, where knowing itself emerges from the politicalness of the subaltern, right? And what distinguishes the politicalness of the subaltern more than anything else is an orientation to space and time very different from that which liberal and mainstream Marxist traditions share. This other time we could call, with clear debt to Walter Benjamin, divine or messianic. Now, let me just unpack what I mean by this. If we put Benjamin's lovely essay on the concept of history in conversation with another equally lovely essay, you remember, Josefa, we were talking about this when you visited Minneapolis, right? In conversation with each other, then it becomes easier to avoid the blandishment of prefixes, right? Which have sometimes tempted us to assume that the converse of homogeneous time is heterogeneous time. Instead, with Benjamin as an interlocutor, we can unfold the threefold, really twofold, as we shall see, of time. So abstract and homogeneous time and space, as I'm sure you know, comes to special prominence with modernity. But as I'm sure you also know, in this time-space formation, it is abstract time which is dominant, as Marx recognized when he talks of the annihilation of space by time, right? This annihilation occurs through the spread of the means-end relations that constitute abstract violence, that constitute capitalism, that constitute also the idea of progress as the unfolding of instrumental reason, right? Still, the dominance of abstract time is also illusory, right? Benjamin implies that abstract violence or purely instrumental violence never occurs by itself. Yeah? That is to say, I may think that I'm acting instrumentally, but even when I'm thinking I'm acting instrumentally, there is affect involved, right? There is an embodied relation to this instrumentality, right? Which even if I'm unaware of, it's very much there. Yeah. So, that embodied aspect changes abstract time. Yeah. So surely the same needs to be said of abstract violence. So surely the same needs to be said of purely abstract and homogeneous time, as Benjamin says of abstract violence, that it is always folded into embodied time, mythic time, right? Just as instrumental violence is constantly folded into mythic violence, so too is abstract time folded into mythic time. In other words, the past is not what historians often assume it to be, merely a dead weight reaching out to both constrict and generate possibilities in our time. Rather, the past sees us most often as part of the exercise of power and domination, as part of a practice of a law-preserving and law-creating violence, to use Benjamin's terms. After all, this is why capital as an abstraction always exists concretely only in heterogeneous, that is, mythic would be a better word, only in heterogeneous time, that is capitalism. Yeah, that is why one talks of capital, but also of capitalism. One can only see capital in capitalism. This is also why there is never a time of pure exploitation. This is also why exploitation is always folded into oppression. And then, in opposition to this, one might say, there is what Benjamin calls divine or messianic time, the time inhabited by the subaltern intimation of freedom, the time from which there arises the political epistemological claims that contest subalternity. As with Benjamin's distinctions between divine and mythic violence, what differentiates divine and messianic time from mythic time is that the former is concerned with justice and the latter is concerned with power. Right? Benjamin's contrast indicates already what is striking about justice here. It is a justice without power. And it's a very difficult thing to think, a justice without power. Right? Which of course leads, if you stay with the word, that phrase, it leads to the concept of love, right? To a thinking of love. It is a justice without power, at least if power is understood as law-making and law-preserving. This does not mean that messianic violence cannot be violent, but divine violence and divine time cannot hide under the mythic fig leaf of law. Here, as Benjamin notes, those who violate the injunction, thou shalt not kill, do not set it aside in that law-making or law-preserving violence, which invokes some higher mission or reason. Rather, they wrestle with it in solitude and in exceptional cases take on themselves the responsibility of ignoring it. Right? If abstract and mythic time are about a future that is calculable, or that is at least sought to be rendered calculable, messianic time is about a future that is to come, that erupts all the time, also into the present, that can be cultivated in the present with the appropriate comportment and discipline. You might wonder what of Derrida's dark reading, which suggests that it is impossible to distinguish messianic violence and by extension messianic time from the lawless Nazi violence of the Holocaust. That reading, to my mind, is wide off the mark, not merely because Nazi violence was nothing if not a law-making violence. Right? And one could say this of Hindutva, one could say this of Zionism, one could say this of almost all statist ideologies that are similar. Right? More pertinently, precisely because messianic violence rejects both law-governing and law-making power, the orientation to this time is marked by a formless and restless egalitarianism, an egalitarianism that both gives the law and stays apart from it, probing the violence of every concrete manifestation of the law. This messianic time in its formless egalitarianism is what is most constitutive of the subaltern articulation of categories such as Dalit, Black, Woman, Adivasi, Trans. Right? It is true that these categories are often governmentalized, including by subaltern groups themselves. But to focus only on the governmentalization would be to forget the most elemental truth, that these categories emerge from and articulate the divine or messianic time that is the subaltern intimation of freedom. Right? This threefold of time, twofold really, because as I just said, abstract time manifests itself phenomenologically only as mythic time. Right? This twofold of time, if you will, or threefold, seems to me retrospectively was what hybrid histories struggled and to a degree failed to give voice to. Yeah. So amongst the things that hybrid history could not apprehend forcefully enough was the futurity of this possibility, of this politics. Only retrospectively, with the rise of Adivasi studies, which Bhangya, etc., and others have played such a significant role in, has that futurity become more visible. I do use the phrase extra-colonial there, it's not that I'm entirely, I have some intimation of it perhaps, but I definitely don't articulate it, right? And that's, in some senses, when I was adding talking of the quasi-totality and quasi-universality yesterday, I was getting back to some of the same stakes that I was trying to talk of. Getting back, hopefully more articulately and more thoughtfully, to some of the same stakes that were there in hybrid histories at that time. So, anyway, I know I've spoken for very long already, and hopefully I'll just end very soon. But let me just say some more remarks in closing, which is that even though every subaltern intimation of freedom accords primacy to a political epistemological claim, the specific manifestation of that claim will be shaped by the singularity of the experience of that group. Hence the various names for this intimation: Adivasi, Dalit, right, Black, right. One could multiply the names, right? And so the question is, what is the specific manifestation? Now I'd like to turn to the second aspect of your phrase, indigeneity, right? What is indigeneity as a political epistemological claim? I'd like to just pick up this question in closing and end with that, right? As an institutional claim to rights, indigeneity involves what Kaka has described as a combination of need right and power right, right? But a political epistemological claim is not institutional, right? Even though it is a non-institutional premise of institutional rights. Yeah? As a political epistemological claim, what needs to be attended to is what you've called the philosophical foundation of indigeneity. Right? At least in the Indian context, indigeneity as a political epistemological claim arguably cannot be synonymous with autochthony. As hybrid histories noted, many Kokanis and some Bhils too were emphatic that they are not from the Dangs. Right? So it's not as though they are claiming that we are the original inhabitants in that sense. That did not stop them from claiming the identity Dangi or Adivasi. What hybrid histories did not thematize adequately was that here, therefore, indigeneity involves something else, claiming a consonance between a land, Dang, right, and a people. Of course, consonance with the land there is in the plains too, as in pre-modern traditions of patriotism, for example, right? What is distinctive about the Adivasi consonance in the Dangs, however, is that indigeneity comes to be articulated in terms of a profoundly modern reworking of pre-modern claims to wildness. Right. Unlike the more easy to naturalize concept of wilderness, hybrid history notes, wildness was actively cathected by Dangis, such that even some wilderness was excluded from it, and some cultivated areas were included in it. Right. In the pre-colonial period, pre-modern Dangis already likely affirmed a certain wildness in relationship to the plains, a wildness that is at odds with the surrounding dominant caste values. Thus, in one of the origin stories of how Bhils arrived in Dangs from the plains villages by actively choosing to consume beef, there is a mirthful defiance of dominant caste norms. And this goat itself is part of a wide-ranging aesthetics of wildness, right? At odds, but also complementary. While dominant caste values of surrounding society saw wildness as inferior, Dangis had enough political and cultural power to sustain a political order centered on a wildness that is hierarchical in its own way. Here too, what in retrospect hybrid histories could not see forcefully enough, not till Adivasi studies made it visible, was that wildness took on new valences from the late 19th century, when the region's complementary relation with the plains broke down and when the Dangs became geographically and politically marginal. It was only after this, deprived of its own hierarchical order, that wildness could be radicalized into indigeneity. Yeah, because wildness and indigeneity are very different concepts, right? The manifestation of the subaltern intimation of freedom that is proper to being Dangi or Adivasi. Of course, this wildness is only one node in a network of analogous and interlinked manifestations of indigeneity. Without quite emphasizing it enough, Hybrid Histories notes how the distinction between speech and writing takes on new charges with the consolidation of colonial power. Now, writing gets a political charge associated with the disempowerment of Adivasis. So, when Dangis affirm oral traditions, they're not simply continuing an older tradition of saying the oral is more valuable. They are affirming an orality that comes after writing. Right? Not an orality that comes before writing, but an orality that comes after writing. Right? Surely something similar happens elsewhere in the subcontinent too. Writing of Jharkhand, Joya John notes Adivasi writers are themselves invested in crafting a socio-linguistic claim to orality, a claim that is quite distinct from sociological and referential claims of other minority literary formations like Dalits writing. Thus, when Jharkhandi poet and activist Vandana Tete distinguishes between Adivasi and vernacular poetry, the latter emerges not from an orality before writing, but an orality that is after writing because it claims indigeneity in terms of particular comportment and relationship to the land. And therefore, an orality that can also resort to writing. Yeah? Wildness and orality, this is only a start to tracking the various nodes of indigeneity. So I'll just end by noting that, throughout this tracking, perhaps one thing must not be lost of. That one thing must not be lost sight of. Indigeneity is not so much a claim to the past as it is a claim to the future. And this is what makes it a politico-epistemological claim. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Shall I just take the question sitting down?
Yeah. I think you can sit here because you stood for a long time. Okay, thank you so much, Ajay, for the wonderful lecture. On the other note, I represent third generation of the Subaltern studies. Ranajit Guha, the founder of the Subaltern Studies project, supervised my supervisor, David Hardiman, and David Hardiman supervised me. So, okay, joke apart, Dr. Skaria actually told us the whole history of Subaltern Studies project. You all know, the context in which Subaltern Studies project came. The political context, basically the 60s, late 60s and 70s, new political movement in India. So the project was actually came to morally stand by these movements. Start with socialist movement, peasant movement, Naxalbari movement, all that. Okay. So as Skaria was mentioning, this project in the beginning tried to advocate for autonomous dominion for the subaltern communities or subaltern groups. And then there were many shifts when Spivak boldly say that can the subaltern speak. I mean, so where the question of psychic epistemological violence got talked about. Okay. So, and then there were from 90s identity movement, and this was also incorporated into project. When this question of oppression and exploitation was talked about and discussed, Guru's intervention, many other Skarias and all that. So basically, the project was evolving and incorporating the new aspiration and new things that were coming over the period. Of course, there are many limitations. I also have many reservation on the project, but the subaltern studies project's intervention actually it's remarkable. So basically now we are in a particular juncture in terms of political clamor. So how do we understand all these days we were talking about oppression and exploitation, and Ajay says this is basically inseparable. So the Hindutva forces using oppression, which we have been using for a long time, and saying, yeah, this is your oppressor, and we all rallying around that, and they are very cleverly separating exploitation from suppression. That's what you mean. So how do we understand that? That's also very important thing. Okay. And the Adivasi question, I mean, which is actually very central in this talk and close to my heart and Skaria's heart. Basically, the freedom, intimation of the freedom. So, I mean, so if you see, I mean, so those who have not read hybrid histories, you must read, this book. It's a classic, okay, in all aspects, I must say that. So, I mean, so it breaks basically all the traditional way of thinking Adivasi society, okay. And freedom is very central. I mean, in history, we talk about periodization, ancient, medieval, and modern. Okay, but for Adivasis, there is no any such kind of demarcation of history, compartmentalization of the history. For them, Mughalai and Mandini. Mughalai represents freedom, Mandini represents unfreedom. Okay, so British, British and pre-British, that's it. Okay, so it's a completely different way of understanding history. Okay, so now how the various things, the identity questions basically, how these identities are forming now. Okay, around indigeneity, and Skaria has tried to problematize and told us the limitation of this indigeneity. Okay, so this subalternity basically itself again inseparable from exploitation. Okay, because you are subaltern, you are exploited, you are suppressed. So that kind of thing is also there. So now, I mean, so how do we understand these new aspirations using identity as a kind of tool to negotiate the public space, the modern space. That's what actually happening. Okay, so Adivasis says, I am indigenous of this land, and I have right over this land. I'm just coming from Kandamahal forest, where it needs one more lecture, but things are horrible, I must say. Okay, and communities are resisting Vedanta and the other groups who are now trying to occupy their forest areas. And there, what is the weapon for the Adivasis? This is just only their past of the freedom, past of their association with the forest and all that. So they're using that and negotiating with the modern state. So in this context, I mean, the identity question, how identities are now basically used to climb modern public spaces, and the new challenge which is coming in form of Hindutva populism. So, and in this context, we have to reframe subaltern or not only the subaltern, but all our epistemological understanding of present academics and society. With this, I think you must be having many questions, so I welcome your responses, clarifications, and questions. Floor is up to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Sujit from Department of History.
Would you like to take one by one, or you can take bunch?
I think a bunch is better.
Okay.
And I'll just ask everyone to introduce themselves.
Please.
I have two kind of questions. The first one is something related to your take on existential identity. So I'm doubtful whether it's existential identity or essential identity you're talking about. Because the first one is in a way connected, or creating a reminder about the woundedness or hauntedness. I mean, it is a strategical positioning. But in relation to the freedom, I think it is an essential identity is much more connected, because it in a way connected to the heteropathetic identity of the human nature. So this is the first one, and the second one is about the messianic time which we are talking about. And how can one locate these different categories and identity into that such a larger? I mean, there is an absence of the politics, the kind of politics what Bhangya was talking about. The very term of the Adivasis is the political category. But when you are locating that category or any other kind of subordinate categories into the messianic time, it actually showing certain kind of lack of the idea of the freedom. Thank you. Freedom.
Freedom. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Next.
Hello, sir.
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm Rohit from Department of History. So, my question would be, as we say, we're shaped by our times and experience. My question is related to northeast of India. So, Subaltern histories resonate a lot with the history of northeast. Yet, in the 11 volumes that were published, there was no specific chapters or mentions. There was bits and pieces of insurgencies and all mentions. So my question is, why was it not properly addressed? And what if it was addressed more? Would it open up a space for the inclusion of the history of Northeast in the Indian historiography?
Why was the history of knowledge not properly addressed?
Northeast. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. He's shooting project. Yeah. Yeah.
Zakir, I teach in Geetham University. Thank you for that lecture. My question is, do you think even a category like Adivasi has its own contestation, particularly with regard to its usage and the meanings that it has in the mainland, and say its non-usage and the meanings that it has in a region like Northeast India, again because of historical political context? Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Tanveer Fazal. Too loud.
Yeah, Tanvi. Yeah.
From Department of Sociology. My question is regarding this point which you furthered on indigeneity and the way in which indigeneity, according to you, the Adivasis see it as a politico-epistemological in terms of future. Now, at the same time, the question of indigeneity now is complicated further with the rise of Hindutva. And if I go back to your earlier, connection between exploitation and oppression, where exploitation is systemic, an idea about systemic kind of oppression, and oppression as an identity as well of who is the oppressor. Now, is that missing in the case of the Adivasi idea of indigeneity? Because otherwise, it allows it to be appropriated within the Hindutva larger ecumenicalism which Hindutva is offering, through the ideas of dharma and panth and so on. That's it.
Okay. Okay, I think you can respond to this, and then again we'll come back. Yeah. Yeah.
Sujit, sorry. Sujit, thank you for those questions. For me, it seems that there is a fundamental difference between an essential identity and an existential identity. And I think, though one is not necessarily enthusiastic about Sartre always, I think this is something that Sartre takes up pretty persuasively, right? Where, he's trying to, in some senses, distinguish between essence and existence, right? And the danger of an essential identity is that it does not allow for plurality, right? If I say that, look, there is this essential figure called trans, there is this essential figure called Adivasi, there is this essential figure called woman, then what about the various embodied ways in which we experience these, to go back to the terms, that Gita was using yesterday, right? So when you have to think of embodiment, right, and an embodiment that you cannot let go of, because some embodiment I can let go of, right? But there are embodiments that I cannot let go of, right? Then I think it makes more sense to talk of the existential, because only that way, it seems to me, can we retain plurality. Your second question was about messianic time, and I totally see your point, that if I had to say, okay, if I had to say that all that is there in politics is this messianic time, then I would be totally depoliticizing, right? What I'm trying to do really is focus and provide a way of thinking of what is this time that we come to inhabit. That can be liberatory. Yeah. Is liberation only a matter of a different political regime? Yeah. Or is it a matter of a comportment? Right? I suppose I am, in a sense, shaped by a certain skepticism about the Marxist tradition of a state-centered revolution. I do think a revolution is necessary, absolutely essential, right? But I think that revolution must have a social dimension, a structural dimension, yeah? As I think, as was being mentioned just 2 days back, contraception perhaps was a bigger revolution, right, than the French Revolution. So again, what I'm trying to say is that, it's not a state-centered revolution, but a social revolution. Now, if one is to think of a social revolution that is focused on the question of a freedom, right, then that social revolution must also change the way we relate to the world, right? And one of the ways that we can relate to the world differently is by an emphasis on this messianic time, which is then not a time that comes somewhere in the future, but that can burst into our present, right? Again, I want to stress that this is not a substitute for, bringing about other very active political changes. So that, say, for example, in other contexts, I've used the idea of relinquishment to describe the relationship between the two, right? The political changes, the economic changes, the structural changes that we want, those belong to the cannot not want, right? One cannot not want them. How can you not want rights? Of course you want rights. Yeah? Of course you want rights. But to forget that rights is an aspiration for right, that rights are produced by some concept of right, yeah, would be to lose, I worry that if we do that, then we might lose sight of things. Yeah. And we can come back to this maybe. Rohit, I totally agree with you. I think this is one of the things that was completely lacking, yeah, even till the 2000s, right? It is only now, right, really in the last decade or so, that this is being redressed, And I cannot offer any defense of that. I think it's just, it's just unacceptable, but that's, yeah. There was a person there, I didn't catch your name, who asked, Adivasi, does it have its own contestations? And, I totally agree. Yeah, that look, this is exactly why I prefer the word existential to essential. Right? If you work with an essential identity of Adivasi, then the moment these contestations arise, somebody will have to go and say, no, this is what is truly Adivasi. That is not truly Adivasi. Right? And we have seen these debates, for example, in anti-caste movements. We have seen these debates in the feminist movement. Right? So whenever you go down the path of saying this is what is essentially, feminist, this is what is essentially anti-caste, this is what essentially Adivasi, you end up in some kind of exclusionary logic. Right? So I would say, yes, it has its own contestations. Let's welcome and embrace those contestations and work through those contestations. Tanvir, I think your question really got to the heart of the question. And in a sense, it goes back also, it allows me to elaborate on the thought that Sujit was sharing. And I think, in a sense, the point you're raising of the relationship with Hindutva is absolutely essential to something that I should pay more attention to. And I wanted to talk more about it. I actually have a very long discussion of it, which I was trying to compress it to 50 minutes. So that's part of what I threw out, because I wanted to focus at least on. But, I would like to put it this way, right? That, in the longer essay, what I say is that, because I put it empirically right now, right? Not entirely empirically, but on a lower level of abstraction. What I would say really is that while the intimation of freedom involved in, say, phenomena like Hindutva or Zionism, right, strives for identity, yeah, subalternity involves, and again I'm drawing on Spivak, right, involves the striving for a position without identity. Yeah? And I really want to stress this, I'm not saying that subaltern groups do not strive for identity. Yeah? They do. And again, identity is something that one cannot not want. Right? But at the same time, when they stay faithful, and if they are to stay faithful to the subaltern intimation of freedom, then they have to strive not for identity, but for a position without identity. So the question then arises, look, what is this phrase, position without identity, right? I mean, it's a nice phrase, but what does it mean really? Yeah. And to submit to that question is to, really submit to, this is one of the reasons I saw, this morning I tried to cram it down into a talk, right? And I realized that I was effectively ending up leaving out the reason for the title. Yeah, but so now I'm very happy to have got a reason to give you the reason for the title. Yeah, so this is to submit to that question is also, as I say in the longer paper, is to also reframe for our times and our place the distinction and relation between two ways of thinking the part, and so two ways of thinking the whole. On the one hand, the sublative relay of universalism, right? Where I say, look, you're a part, but we're part of a larger whole, right? That's what Hindutva is really doing, yeah. And on the other hand, the aporetic relay of quasi-universalism and its myriad socialities on the outskirts of recognition, yeah. Let me unpack what I mean a bit by that, yeah. I'm sure all of you have in some of your courses read Charles Taylor's classic essay on recognition, right? Where he talks of authenticity, right? And and what he talks about, what he means by authenticity is uniqueness, right? And when I use the phrase cunning of recognition, I was drawing on Elizabeth Povinelli's brilliant critique of Taylor, right? Where she says that, look, recognition is part of the way that modern societies subsume identities within a statist order, right? Hindutva is an identity of this sort. Yeah? Its obsession with the past is symptomatic of its obsession with authenticity. The CA-NRC initiative is also an attempt to institute the term recognition on these terms. Right? By contrast, when Spivak says that no one can say I am a subaltern in whatever language, right? One has to think of what's happening here. And I want to repeat what I said yesterday, right? There is a distinction between thinkers and non-thinkers, right? A thinker is somebody who is complex enough and deep enough that you can use their formulations to, Heidegger again puts it beautifully. He says, the greatest gift a thinker gives is his unthought. Yeah? That is to say, what a thinker does not think, but makes it possible for us to think. And sometimes when we think what they have made it possible for us to think, right, we may think against them, beyond them, right, but still, in a way, being faithful to them, right? So if you read Spivak's, in that spirit, we must qualify and read this astute observation against its explicit professions by drawing on Spivak itself. If subalternity were an identity, or if subalternity could be challenged only by claiming agency, right, then Spivak would be entirely correct. But the phrase that Spivak uses often to describe subalternity is position without identity. And Spivak does not elaborate on this usage. It remains part of her unthought, so to speak. Right? The subaltern is in a position of without identity, because the subaltern is not unique in the way that Hindutva tries to create a unique identity. Right? If you talk of the Hindu of Hindutva, now that is an attempt to define an identity in terms of an essence. Yeah, right. But so in some senses, when you say position without identity, you're talking of a relationship with power. So a subaltern does not have access to authenticity, right? And that is what is involved in saying that, I am subaltern. And I think one can think of Dalit studies also where this is happening. I think, for example, of Ankit Kavade's observation about the impossibility of Dalit studies, right? And when he talks of, and he's saying something similar about this, yeah. So I know this is a very long answer, but it's something that I really wanted to say, and I was very sad though that I couldn't say it, and your question really allowed me to get to it.
So, how much time we have? It's almost getting 11:30. One more round. Can we go for one more round? Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
May I begin? Yeah.
So, yeah, please.
Manoj here.
Yeah, Manoj.
Hindutva folks prefer to label Adivasis as Vanvasis. Will you please tell us the connotations and implications of this distinction?
Okay.
And the related question, it may seem a little off topic. Will you also tell us if there is a distinction between Hindutva and Brahmanism?
Okay. Swan? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Ajay. Your reflections really helped kind of flesh out some of the unthought of subaltern studies, for me at least. And I was asked, it presented me with the paradox, which I want to kind of ask you to, think with me and elaborate. So, in the late 20th century, there was a certain way of progressive socialist thinking in which subaltern studies was part of, and it gave a certain position to Adivasi and anti-caste politics. This was, and so Spivak's critique of it seems to be that the nature of oppression and exploitation render a certain kind of muteness. Muteness, or there is a kind of problem of recognition for us as scholars, and who are privileged in our own ways in the academy. But by the time we come to political society, more than a decade and a half afterwards, and the kinds of engagements with governmentality that Partha and others have written about, by that moment we seem to have shifted. So in fact, we are now able to, things are becoming intelligible. The stratagems of the subaltern are now intelligible within the domain of governmentality. And so, ironically, paradoxically, in the earlier moment, while there was a certain progressive socialist kind of ethos, there was also what Fabian would call the denial of coevalness. Ironically, by focusing on the state as the only game in town in political society, somehow we are now coeval as citizens or citizen subjects. So this, for me, poses a paradox. And, one possibility is that the answer is really democracy. That was not taken in seriously in the late 20th century projects. The democracy itself was just seen as a bourgeois fiction. And with political society, that is no longer possible. Other possibility is someone like you actually as an important figure in kind of shifting the discourse, because you actually got off the chair and the archives and you went and listened to the goats, right? So once you actually listen and you understand the complexities, then it is
Sorry,
possible.
can you make your question shorter?
Yeah, so I was asking whether it is, so how do you see from your intervention, but also broadly, in terms of democratization, rights, claim making, etc.?
Okay, Swan.
Yeah, I'm Swan. Yeah. So, Ajay, your ambitious project of subalternity as a political epistemological project of intimation of freedom looks very appealing, but can also be deeply problematic because the kind of implicit assumption there of this project being realized without power or identity without position becomes appealing at the abstract, intellectual exercise, but becomes deeply problematic because it does not serve, the practical agenda of transforming the lives, realities of maybe transforming the unequal power relations that obtains on the ground, right? That's one. The second is in the wake of the consolidation of Hindutva, this becomes deeply problematic because when you have all the space being dominated by the structures of power, claiming agency or claiming, freedom by the indigenous become deeply problematic because you can all the time be at the receiving end of the state power, which essentially reinforce one's marginality as well as one's, oppressed, existential precarity in that sense. So how do you then really, as a pragmatic political agenda, reclaim your intimation of freedom? And if that is not feasible, then are we then engaging in a politics of impossibility?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajay, for that very interesting talk, but much to think about. And I'm going to take up from where Swan left in his first question. If we think of the phrases you used, because I was thinking, what would intimation, subaltern intimation of freedom be? One of the things you said, I could imagine as being, not creating subalternity would be non-structural forms of, I don't know, I was going to say domination, if that were at all possible, because you do have a lot of discussion about individual-based, but not structure-based domination that exists. The other is that you thought of it in terms of justice without power, and subsequently the phrase Swan mentioned, position without identity, which happily can be used to say that it should be thought of in terms of a non-differentiated self. And that can very easily fit into a much more homogenizing agenda. So would you consider that element? Second thing, if I may, I was a bit puzzled because you started with new social movements, and some sociologists would remind me of the authors who made that distinction on grounds of earlier movements really focusing on structural and systemic change, while new social movements are thinking in terms of just betterment of life conditions. And in that case, Dalit movements, Adivasi movements, women's movement were all part of that including class movements, were part of seeking systemic changes or pointing to certain structures of discrimination which need to be changed. But I thought you had put them into the other bracket of new social and needed some clarification. And then when Professor Bhukya mentioned that these are identity-based movements, I think a lot of clarity came because now one can see the problem very clearly. Identity making is always about drawing boundaries of including and excluding, and can easily be used, and one can see how it can and has been used. And when it gets linked to issues of domination rather than merely exploitation, then structures, it's all power related, and you begin to think of structures of domination even between people who were otherwise marginalized. So you have many more complex structures of domination rather than a single, easily sort of unraveled story. So I thought...
Okay, thank you. I think we may last question. Yeah.
Sir, myself Prof from Department of History.
What's your name?
Department of History.
No, name.
Prabhakar. Sir, my question is in addition of the sir asked question that Hindutva efforts of appropriating Adivasis as Vanvasis, and in 2016 Union Government of India also dropped the other category where earlier Adivasi used to identify themselves in others category apart from this major religions. So now they are forced to identify under the folds of major religions. So at the same time they are trying to appropriate Adivasis as the Vanvasis. He asked the implication of that, and I'm adding there the demand of separate code as a Sarna religion or Sarna code. The implication of these two things.
Yeah, Janjati is also there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you can respond.
Sir.
Yeah.
One question. So
Okay.
I'm Dasrath from Department of History.
I didn't catch your name.
Dasrath. Department of History. So recently I was go through by your book Hybrid Histories, as Professor Bhangya sir also recommended that book. That's why. So in that book, and also as Professor Bhangya sir noted out, that Adivasis always see the compartmentization of the history in two themes: the pre-colonial and colonial. Sir, when we think about the contemporary period, when we go through the writing subaltern history at the time of contemporary, so we see so many things. So as Professor Gurpreet Mahajan noted out, that we should think about the text and context. So when we go to there are three levels of context, as she said. So the third level of context, when we put the text into the context of the ideas which is dominating in the contemporary period. So I would like to cite the Mark Elvin. So he said about the modernity and everything. So in that his PDF, he discussed about modernity is there is a one dimension of the modernity is that the combined efforts to establish the control, the power over the people, establish the control of the people, nature, and the intellectual. So I'd like to say, in this contemporary period, there are so many things which are changing. Like internet is coming, AI, global. We are living in a global world. So how do you see what perspective we have to use to reflect the situation of the subaltern communities in this contemporary period? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Dasrath. Yeah, I think we'll close this. And each question I'm sure need another separate lectures. But that's what organizers want from you.
Very, very Manoj, to take up the Adivasi Vanvasi, to take up Adivasi Vanvasi, obviously the terms are very different. Adivasi is an insurgent term, right? Vanvasi is an inclusive sublative term, right? Whereas a Vanvasi, I can, make you part of, right, a larger identity. Hindutva and Brahmanism, sometimes I like to say that, I think I've actually said this somewhere, maybe I don't remember, but at least I will be saying it in what I'm writing, is that Hindutva is a Brahmanism without Brahmins necessarily, right? And that's a very good way of thinking of it, right? It's a Brahmanism that abstracts itself also by emerging at the figure of the nation, right? Which is not necessarily part of the older caste order that Ambedkar is attacking, right? And so there's a fundamental transformation that's taken place. Again, there's much more to say, but I'll be very brief. Uday, again, in a very, very brief spirit, we can talk more later. Yes, I do think that the denial of co-evilness is gone. Yes, I do think that democracy has changed things significantly. But also, I think what we are talking of, what Spivak is talking of, is a certain psychic and epistemic condition, right? And in that sense, democracy, which we cannot not want, which we must institutionally fight for, right, is, so think of the subaltern, that's why I use the word intimation, right? Because an intimation is not something you realize. I'm not saying intimation in the sense, intimation today, realization tomorrow, right? I'm saying always intimation, yeah? And I think that's very, very important to remember, yeah? Yeah. Swan, yes, and I think that will help me also, Gurpreet, I think that will also help me answer your question, right? That precisely because I'm talking of always intimation. When you use the word politics of impossibility, yes, I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking of. The politics of impossibility, right? Again, it's a Derridian phrase, as you know, right? And as Derrida also is very clear, when he says politics of impossibility, it does not mean that you give up on everyday politics, right? The politics that you absolutely need to challenge domination, right? To talk of the politics of impossibility is to talk of the comportments that are needed to respect what we are fighting for, in addition to and beyond our concrete demands, right? To remember that, that a world of care and love that we are fighting for is not going to be brought about by these rights. These rights are meant to enable us to reach that, right? And so it's, in some senses, so again, I don't know whether there can be I think one of the biggest mistakes that Gandhi makes is to assume that this by itself is enough, right? And so that's where I would completely agree with you, that the politics of impossibility is essential, but it is also precisely that, impossible. Yeah? And that's why, again, the word intimation matters, right? And I think that's where, Gurpreet, I think, precisely because in that sense, I think the question of the non-differentiated self belongs more to the logic of identity than to the logic of position without identity, right? So that's, Gurpreet, again, very quickly about the new social movements. I do think, I think that's why I was trying to reframe the new social movements as a matter of oppression, rather than in terms of smaller demands or only identity-based demands, right? Because when you introduce a dimension of oppression, then you can rethink it more broadly, right? Dashrath, I think your question is in some senses very difficult to answer, right? Because I wish I could, because the question of what is how with so many things changing in the contemporary world, what would an Adivasi politics involve today? Honestly, also, I would feel a little arrogant answering that, because given my location, I don't think I really can answer that, but I think it's something that will have to be, again, shaped out from the very existential positions that different communities find themselves in. So I'm going to, cry off on that one. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jai. Yeah, I think organizers have something to announce. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Skaria, for this insightful lecture. I also thank Professor Bhukya for chairing this session and engaging with the audience and all the questions. We will have a short break and we will come back at 12 for the next panel discussion, which is writing identity. Please be back here in 10 minutes so we can start on time. Thank you so much.